I'll be speaking with Stephen Kobasa. He's a member of the support committee of the Kings Bay Plowshares, 7 activists who are in jail in Georgia without bail now for over a month in an anti-nuclear protest. Good afternoon, Stephen.
Good afternoon, Stan.
So where is Kings Bay and what is it home to?
Kings Bay is on the southeast Georgia coast. Since the early 1980s, it has been the eastern base for the Trident nuclear submarines that carry intercontinental ballistic missiles armed with nuclear weapons. There are 2 of those bases, one at Kings Bay and the other on the west coast in Bremerton, Washington.
How many nuclear bombs would be on one of these Tridents?
Well, it varies. They can be armed with different kind of constellations of warheads, but probably an approximation for it would be, you would have something like 300. I should be right about this because we were talking there. I think it's 360 Hiroshima bombs on each one. That would be the net effect if of the most commonly used warhead.
That's enormous. I mean, you could blow up an entire country, 360 bombs.
Yep. One of them is more weapons than most individual countries have. So there are 6 of them there and 8 on the west coast. There were more than that, but they converted, I think, 4 of them to what they call guided missile carriers. So they're armed now with cruise missiles. That was part of the START treaty agreements. Those are still massively powerful, but they don't, at this point at least, carry nuclear weapons.
And so what was the nature of the protest? What is the reason for the protest?
Well, it happened on April 4th, which, as you remember, was the anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King. And the 7 went in very much inspired by King's condemnation of the evils of racism, materialism, and militarism in this country, and the ways in which those all defined the terrible sort of losses of peace and justice in our recent history. And they felt that this particular site was a kind of perfect encapsulation of all that is wrong with the ways in which our government defines its relationship to the world. So they carried on a number of banners that they brought in, the words of King about these various issues, and I think continue to be sort of inspired by what he represented.
And that word plowshares, what does that refer to?
It comes from a passage in the book of the prophet Isaiah, which envisions a world in which swords are beaten into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. A conversion of a sense of definitions of violence into ones of fruitfulness and peacemaking.
Various kinds of plowshare protests have gone on for many years, right?
Yeah, the first was back in 1980, the Plowshares 8 at a GE center in Pennsylvania, King of Prussia. And since then, there have been, I think, near to 100 of various kinds internationally. They haven't been only in this country, but I think the most notable ones, the ones we're most aware of, happened here.
And so what did they intend to do?
They intended to make clear the threat to life and justice that these weapons represent. For them, Trident represents what they call Omnicide. It means the destruction of everything. Trident is completely indiscriminate and absolute in terms of the destruction it could do. And so all creation is put at risk. And for these seven, most of whom come out of a Roman Catholic tradition, the idea that the divine creation should be held hostage that way by human machines is simply is a crime. Well, it's a moral crime, but it's also illegal according to various treaties that the United States has been a signatory to. And they went specifically to deliver an indictment of this country for holding those weapons and being prepared to use them.
So they were taking with them a document,
yes,
and then something else.
They brought in various banners and also hammers to symbolically disarm the weapons that they found there. They went in three separate groups, three separate locations. One group went to the weapons bunkers, and they marked that with their blood. And another went to an administration building, also marked there by banners and blood. And the third group went to it's a kind of monument, which is actually a Trident missile, the D5, that's carried by these submarines. So a mock-up of it is mounted there on the base. And a group went there and hung a banner with a quotation from King, that if we don't put an end to war, to the effect that if we don't put an end to war, war will be the end of us. So they wanted to be a physical presence. They wanted to be engaged in a direct action that pointed out to a country that's not always conscious of it, how extraordinarily dangerous it is to have these weapons and the kind of threat they represent.
And at some point they're arrested.
They were taken into custody by local police on the base, and they were first brought to a county jail. They were later charged there with state crimes, trespassing and destruction of property. But they have since been, an indictment came down this week from the federal courts, and those will now supersede the state charges. So they will be in court tomorrow for the first of the preliminary hearings. They'll have to deal with probably technicalities in terms of representation, that sort of thing. There may be an offer of bail, which none will probably accept.
We'll get back to that in a second, but let's talk about who these people are. I assume you know some or all of them personally?
Yes, I've met all of them and know some of them well. Yeah.
So,
Mark Colville, of course, of the Amistad Catholic Worker in New Haven, would be the most familiar, I think, to your listeners. This is the second of the Plowshares actions that Mark's been involved in. So, all of them, to one degree or another, are influenced by a long history, not just of the Plowshares action, but of thinking in traditions of Catholic pacifism and civil disobedience that date back, to the Catonsville 9 protests of 50 years ago, the burning of the draft records by a group of Catholic activists. So there's a long tradition to which they lay claim, and I think that, while there are different ways in which they have come to that, many have done it through the Catholic worker movement founded by Dorothy Day and Peter Morin here in this country in the 1930s. So a number of them are from active Catholic worker communities.
Well, speaking of that, Dorothy Day recently was declared a saint by the Catholic Church. Does the Catholic Church support these kind of activities or the Catholic worker movement itself?
Well, that's it. Interesting. She has not yet been declared a saint, but she is on, the process is underway for that to happen. that's a sort of point of contention among some Catholic workers whether Dorothy Day would have appreciated such efforts. But the other connection with this action is that her granddaughter was one of the activists who was involved in this particular.
Was one of the people arrested?
Yeah.
Who's that?
Yeah, her. I thought I'd put it on your material. That's
I have, the names here.
Martha Hennessy is her name.
I see. And that's
Yeah.
the granddaughter of Dorothy Day.
Yeah.
And Elizabeth McAllister, she's the widow of.
Philip Berrigan. She's a longtime activist in her own right. She and her husband Philip founded the Jonah House community in Baltimore, which for decades was a center of, witness against weapons and injustice in this country.
And Carmen Trotta worked with a little bit about Yemen protests in New York City.
Right, and he's down the New York Catholic worker for many years. Yep. Steve Kelly is a Jesuit priest who has also been involved in a number of other Plowshares actions, a highly committed and passionate worker for peace. Claire Grady is from the Ithaca Catholic Worker, Ithaca, New York. She is one of really a circle of family who have been passionate activists, and she too has been involved in other Plowshares efforts.
And we sort of lost one question about whether the Catholic Church is helping in some respect.
That's sort of a larger question. I mean, it's interesting because there's always been a struggle in terms of the Catholic tradition about especially around the issue of the just war theory, which was kind of the defining tradition from the late 19th century on to say, there were certain conditions under which a war, even though it had destructive consequences, could be defined as just. The argument made by this community and many others has been that you could never have a nuclear war which would meet those criteria. And so it has been quite remarkable and in the last few years with Pope Francis to see how this definition has shifted because of his statement just about a year ago that it wasn't simply the use of such weapons which was morally culpable, but the very possession would be equally sinful. So that's an extraordinary step to say that there's no possibility that these terrible machines could ever fall under some kind of moral exception. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't still, people who would claim to be in the Catholic tradition who might argue otherwise, but certainly the larger question, especially as it's been considered by the American bishops, has always sided on the side of opposition to nuclear weapons. That doesn't mean that every Plowshares has been equally supported, but I think you will find that there is a great deal more encouragement and sympathy in the institutional church for these positions than there has been.
Now let's go or end with the legal situation again. I understand the state charges. If it had only been state charges, it actually would have been more dangerous for them that the penalties were even more severe and that they welcomed the federal charge.
I don't know that that's true. I mean, the federal charge is severe enough. I mean, there's a maximum penalty for the depredation of government property of 10 years. So, that's fairly significant. And for some of those in the group who are repeat offenders, obviously the chances of getting a higher sentence are greater. But it's clearly, it's the federal government who's at issue here. It's the federal government who authorizes, who funds, who, creates a system of values that declares that these things are somehow necessary to our security. And what this group is saying is that they have the opposite effect, that they put us at great risk, not just physically, but morally in the world, and that people need to act in ways which will abolish them absolutely. And that's what I think their example is meant to represent.
Now, I understand they were denied bail. Is that right?
They were denied bail in the state courts. the magistrate agreed that they were probably not at risk of flight, but that she thought they would probably go back and do it again if she let them go. It's not. I don't know if it would have been unreasonable, but in any case, it was denied. What will happen?
That's not supposed to be the reason for bail. Bail is to assure that you show up for the.
Yes, well, as we know, the courts there are theories and then there are practices. So they're hearing tomorrow in federal court may raise the issue again, but and this is something that I talked with Luz Koval about recently. Even if bail is offered, none of them will accept it if it involves any kind of monetary commitment. If they're allowed to be free on what they call their own recognizance, that is released with a promise to appear, then there may be some members who would come out. But if any kind of conditions are attached, they won't. So it really doesn't matter whether the bail is $500 or $10,000. They won't take advantage of that.
And what do you hear about conditions in the jail and their spirits?
Well, the spirits seem to be quite good. The jail they're in now is somewhat larger, somewhat more open spaces. The men and women are obviously separated, but they get to meet for conversations with their legal advisors. They're getting lots of mail. They're getting books and stuff set into them. So, jail, no matter how relatively comfortable is always uncomfortable. It's not a pleasant place to be, and they're looking at what could be extended terms in federal confines, which could be a little bit more intense.
Well, thanks for all this. Now, if people want to learn more about this, perhaps support the people in some way, is there websites, Facebook, things like that, way to contact?
There's a website, kingsbayplowshares.org, which is going to be continually updated with both an archive of what's happened so far, but also what will continue to happen in the courts and otherwise. So that would be accessible for those not worried about the confidentiality of their personal information. There's a Facebook page, also Kings Bay Plowshares. And as some folks who know Mark and Luce, who are the co-founders of the Amistad House Catholic Worker here in New Haven, know that their activism has many roles around immigrant rights, around housing in the Hill community where their house is located. It's at 203 Rosette Street. And so their commitment, it's a kind of consistency across the board about, that each thing they do is linked. The Plowshares action is not fundamentally different from feeding people who are hungry in this community.
And they do that, give out breakfasts, and lunch.
That every day. And so, and the reason, and part of the argument that they would make is the reason people are hungry is the the monstrous diversion of resources to weapons like the Trident, away from the simple needs for food and shelter that many of the poor in our community have. So, they are not unrelated. They're not unrelated actions, and I think the Plowshares movement never claims exceptionalism. They never suggest that what they do is somehow superior or more perfect than what other people are doing to change that terribly unjust system of capitalist frenzy and selfishness that marks our culture. So many people do many different things in many different ways, but the important thing about this particular action is that especially in the dialogues of the day, there's a Mennonite writer by the name of John Stoner who said the effect that a country that's held the sword of nuclear holocaust over the world for 60 years and accuses someone else of having invented terrorism is out of touch with reality. And that's what I think brings people to actions like this one. Are being out of touch with the reality that we live with every day and accept it as if it's normal. And an action like this says, no, living in a world where that threat exists is not normal. It doesn't have to be accepted, and it needs to be resisted.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.